how I live my hippie life.
In the late 1940s, a culture which soon became known as the Beat Generation emerged from the ruins of a post-World War II world. Unable to continue living with conformity, these people ran around with the mindset of freedom, peace, and music. These artistic-minded people started appearing early in places like New York. Known as beatniks, this generation composed of musicians played mainly in small local coffee shops and clubs. The average beatnik wore a multitude of unique items, ranging from berets and sunglasses to turtlenecks and striped shirts. They described themselves as cool and hip while they played cool jazz. They soon earned a new nickname that leads them into the generation of the hipsters. With the Cold War becoming overwhelmingly hard to deal with for most Americans, peace-loving beliefs grew stronger and more rapidly than ever before during the 50s and 60s. While the civil rights movements were spreading through the states, they caused even more young Americans to change their views of the world to wanting a peace-loving society. It looked as something new was coming into play in the world. Something full of life, something radical. Just one more push, then all the young Americans began to spiral into this cultural epiphany that was plaguing the nation. Then, in 1965, Americans walked onto Vietnamese soil, and that one push fell on the Americans. Small groups of protesters started to appear, claiming the lottery draft was unjust. Later, in 1968, after the Tet Offensive, the protest boomed in a way never before seen in America had never seen such large-scale protests to a war. The public felt betrayed because of what the government was telling them, and what the media was showing them were two entirely different worlds. After Tet, more and more people started to openly oppose the war. They saw the Americans being brought home in body bags and wanted to stop American involvement in Vietnam. Many of the protests were peace-loving, tie-dye-wearing people who later became known as hippies. The counterculture movement of peace and love, also known as the hippie movement, started in San Francisco and spread like a wildfire across the nation. The word hippie became branded with stereotypes. They were looked at as a peace-loving people who wore colorful clothing and ran around with flowers on their clothes while taking huge amounts of LSD. Most of these stereotypes aren't wrong at all. The hippie movement was backed by young men and women who despised the United States government, even though most of them lived off social welfare programs like Medicare, unemployment programs, and food stamps. They wished for a world where love and equality were dominant in everyday life for men and women, idolizing people like Bob Dylan while being moved by music like that of the Beatles and the Grateful Dead soon became known worldwide. From 1960 to 1970, the number of Americans that had tried marijuana had skyrocketed from a couple 100,000 to 8 million. Through the teachings of people like Dr. Timothy Leary, people began using drugs to explore their minds and hope to find some form of knowledge or enlightenment to achieve true freedom. The drugs were also used as inspiration for art and music. The drug problem in society was out of control, and there was little plan to try and stop it. With Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement happening at the same time, it was viewed as the individual's problem for the time being. Hippies had two main beliefs. One was that less government involvement there was, the more opportunities people would have to experience natural goodness. They believed that this natural goodness would police society on its own, and there would eventually be no need for government at all. The world would run itself, the free market taking over. Although they made these accusations, many hippies were accepting the government's help, supplying them with all their money through social welfare programs like unemployment programs, Medicare, and food stamps, leaving a poor view on hippies because of the contradictions in their actions and their beliefs. Their beliefs spread so far that in 1969, at a festival known as Woodstock, had sold out for 3 days of peace and music. Word spread through underground networking systems that used newspapers, and when those 3 days came, over 1 million hippies showed up for the event, spontaneously forming their own temporary city. After the hippies' 3 days of peace and music, the reckless lives of freedom and peace would soon end. Ronald Reagan was the main reason that the days of anti-conformity would have to be cut short. His policies and hippie were well known by everyone, very clear cut.
It began a year ago when the so-called free speech advocates, who in truth have no appreciation for freedom, were allowed to assault and humiliate the symbol of law and order, a policeman on the campus, and that was the moment when the ringleaders should have been taken by the scruff of the neck and thrown out of the university once and for all.
Through his actions, we are able to assume that Ronald Reagan disliked the counterculture and was willing to go to the extremes to eliminate the problem. At the People's Park incident, Reagan sent the police to quell a protest. He told them to use any means necessary to stop the protest, resulted in one life being taken and numerous injuries among the outraged civilians. The counterculture's glorious days were coming to an end thanks to Reagan. The conformity approval rating increasing and the weakening of welfare programs that the hippies relied on so heavily were slowly picking apart everyday life for the flower children. The aging generation of youth would in fact pull America out of the counterculture movement. The hippie generation did leave their mark on society. People today now express themselves more freely than ever before, and many say that the counterculture movement provoked this behavior out of the public. Groups rally together to protest and speak their minds on what they think is right, and the views of peace, love, and freedom have been changed in the people's eyes all throughout the world. With their equality, the hippies help show the rest of the world that people can live equally and that people aren't so different from one another. Hippies were a crucial part of the civil rights movement, and without them, it wouldn't have been possible. Even with all this good impact, the days of peace and love had to come to an end. The hippies were a doomed race from the beginning.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end of our elaborate plans, the end of everything that stands, the end, no safety or security.